What's up everybody, welcome back. So in the last video we started our drag and drop system, and today we're going to continue working on it. So we need to make some changes to existing stuff, and we're going to add some stuff like inventory sizes and make sure that the stacking of our contents works the way we want to. So we have quite a lot to do today, so let's just dive into it. And we're going to start in our third person character to set up our inventory size. And for that we want to go to the server load inventory from save game event. So that should be on the event graph somewhere. Load inventory from save game. So that's over here. Server load inventory from save game. So what we want to do here is add the rest of the slots to our inventory with empty slots. So first we're going to set an inventory size, and we're going to create a variable for that. So that's the inventory size. And that's going to be an integer. And let's just drag it in here, and I'm going to set it to 21 for the player. So I have 3 rows of 7. And then I want to get a for loop. So let's look for a for loop. And then we need to make sure that we do not overwrite our existing inventory from the save game. So we're going to grab our player inventory, and we're going to grab the length from the current array in here. And we can plug that into the first index. And for the last index we need to subtract 1 from the inventory size. So subtract 1 and then plug that into the last index. Just like this. And then we're simply going to set an array element for the player inventory. So we're going to drag in the player inventory, set array element. And then we can make an inventory structure. So drag off the item and make an inventory content structure. And we're simply going to add an empty item. So I'm going to call this empty. And that should be good to go. So make sure we enable size to fit, and we plug in the index from the for loop. So this will make sure that our inventory has 21 slots, and we can work with that. So now we want to go to our widget for the inventory slot, and we want to start making some changes in there. So let's open up our widgets folder and go to the widget blueprint inventory slot. So first of all, in the event graph, we set up the actual widget over here in event construct. And we want to make sure that if this is an empty slot, that we do it a little bit differently. So first we're going to disconnect the get table row, and we're going to simply compare the item row name over here. So drag it in is equal to, and we want to make sure that it's empty. So we need to grab a branch over here and plug everything in. So if this is an empty slot, we're simply going to hide the text for the item amount and the border for the icon. So we can drag in the border inventory icon and the text item amount. And for those two, we're going to set the visibility and make sure they are hidden. So this goes into the true bin, and if it's false, we're simply going to do what we used to do. So this should make our empty slots display correctly, and then we want to go to the onDrag detected function over here. No, that's not correct, sorry, to the onMouse button down function. And we're going to add a condition to this branch over here, so we cannot drag empty slots. So we can simply compare the item row name over here to an empty slot, so is equal to empty. We might be better off using a not equal, by the way, so let's grab a not equal. So if the left mouse button is down and the slot is not empty, so let's grab an empt and plug everything back in. Then we can drag the slot. So that's good to go as well. And now we want to make some minor changes in the designer over here. So first of all, I'm gonna go to the size box and make sure that for the visibility, right now it's set to non-hit testable, and I want to make sure it's set to visible. And then I'm going to go to the border for the background, and I'm going to add padding to the border for 2 units. So what this will do is make sure that our grid will be divided into slots. So I'm grabbing my example project here, so we have the actual slots in between the grids. And we want to make sure that we set the size box to visible, otherwise we can drop items in between these slots over here and they will not register to be dropped on top of a slot. So that's why we're setting the size box to visible. So those should be the changes inside of the designer, and then we want to go to the player inventory widget. So let's minimize this one. We have the player inventory over here. And what we want to do here is grab the borders for the world content. So that's the border for the inventories actually. So the border inventory world. And we're going to set the actual border to size to content. And we're going to do the same thing for the player border. So also enable size to content over here. And now we can go into the blueprint for the container and make a little update in there. So let's open up our BP container, because we also want to give our containers an inventory size. So we can go to our event begin play, for example, and we do not have that yet. So let's create an event begin play. And first of all, we want to make sure that we are the server. So let's grab a branch and check if we are the server or not. Yes, server. Plug it in. And then we're going to set the inventory size. So let's make another variable for that, inventory size. And that's the integer again. So we're going to drag it in over here. If we are the server, I'm going to set the inventory size to 14 for now. And then we can do the same thing as we did for the player. So we can drag in the container contents array and get the length from here. And then we want to get a for loop. So the length of the array is the first index, and then the last index will be the inventory size -1. So subtract 1 from the size, plug it into the last index, and then we're going to use our set array element for the container contents. And make sure that we add empty slots. So we're going to plug in the index over here, enable size to fit, and then make an inventory content structure and simply call this empty. And that should take care of the container inventory size. So with those things set up, we want to go into the inventory slot and we want to start adding indexes for the actual inventory slots. So to make sure we can add our own stacking system and our items do not auto stack anymore, we need to add inventory indexes to our inventory slots, or at least that's the way that I did it. Because if we have multiple stacks with the same item, we cannot simply search for an item name anymore if we want to get a specific slot inside of our inventory. So what we're going to do, we're going to go inside of our inventory widget first, so the inventory slot. And inside here, we're going to create one new variable, and that's called our inventory index. So let's create that. No. Oh, really? So inventory index, and that's an integer. And we want to make sure that it's instance editable and exposed on spawn. And then we don't really need to do anything in here, so we can close this down for now. And then we're going to go inside of our player inventory widget, and we're going to open the setup inventory or setup inventory grid function. And in here, we need to make sure that we update our create widget node. So we just added our instance editable variable. So we're going to refresh the node over here that creates the inventory slot. And over here we have our new inventory index variable, and we want to plug that inside of the array index from the for each loop. So we actually assign an index to our slots. So with that setup, we want to go inside of our third person character, and we actually want to change the add and remove item from inventory functions. And some of you might think that's a little bit of double work, and I guess somewhat you are right. But I'm trying to show this in the way I develop it, and you cannot really make features like this at once. So it's really hard to just come up with all features at once and just code it. It's probably not going to work. There's going to be stuff you need to fix. You don't know what's wrong. So usually when you make something like this, you will design it in steps. And the actual videos that I'm showing you are the steps that I made to design this. So yes, there are some double work in here, but to me that's actually the best way to learn. So I'm not just showing you the finished result, but I'm actually showing you how I made this and the actual workflow of how this could work if you would design something like this yourself. So long story short, we're gonna change the add item to inventory function. And the easiest thing we can do is simply get rid of everything and build it from scratch. So yeah, let's just delete all of this. And then the first thing we want to do is make sure that we add our inventory index to our inputs for the function. So let's create a new input, and that's going to be the inventory index. So that's our integer. And then we also need a bunch of local variables, so let's create those as well. And for now, I'm going to get rid of all of the existing ones. There we go. So the first one is the local inventory index. And that's our integer again. Then we also want the local inventory contents. Oh, really? Well, that's fine. Contents. So that's the inventory content structure. And then we're going to add the local content to add. And that's also an inventory structure. And the last one is the local is slot found. And we're going to make this a boolean. So first what I want to do is drag off the pickup contents, and we're going to check the length of the array. So I made this an array, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because if you pick up an item that looks like an orb, for example, why would it contain a fan? So what we're going to do is drag off the array and make sure that it's not greater than 1. So a pickup item can basically only contain one type of items, and that really makes the most sense, to be honest. So we're going to plug in a branch over here and simply add a little warning. So if we add multiple items to a pickup item, that's not going to work. So we're going to simply say print, and then we're going to say warning, pickup items can only contain one item. Warning, pickup items can only contain one item. So that's just a little warning, and then we want to drag off our pickup contents, and we're going to store them inside of our content to add. So we simply want to get the first item in the array over here. So drag off it, get, and we're going to get a copy, not a reference. Oh, really? So we're going to get the first index and store that inside of our local contents to add variable. Plug it in over here, and let's just plug it in over here as well. Then we want to set our local inventory index. So let's drag the setter for that as well and plug it into the input node and make sure that that one is set up as well. And then we're going to grab our player inventory, and we want to know what's inside of that slot currently. So what we can do is grab the player inventory from the normal variables, and we're going to drag off here and also get a copy. And we're going to get a copy from the local inventory index, and this is what we're going to store inside of the local inventory contents. So that's over here. Plug it in, and let's call this the local player inventory contents to make it a little bit more clear what this actually is. So this is what's inside the current slot of the player's inventory. So we're going to grab a branch over here, plug it in, and the first thing we're going to do is check if the local inventory index is actually smaller than 0. So let's get a less than node. And if it's less than 0, we do not actually have a slot identified over here in the item to add. So that means that we picked up an item from the ground, for example, and we are not dragging it on top of a slot directly. So then we need to look for a valid slot by ourselves. So what we can do for that is get a for each loop from our player inventory. So drag it in here, get a for each loop. And then we're going to look for an item that is empty. So first of all, drag off the array element, and we're going to break the inventory content structure. And then we compare the item row name. So let's do equal to. And if this slot is currently empty, then we can use this slot. So we're going to add a branch over here, plug it in. And then we're going to set our local isSlotFound boolean to true. And obviously, like I always do, I forgot this needs to be a for each loop with break. So let's grab a for each loop with break and let's move over the pins quickly. Get rid of the normal one. So if we found a valid slot, then we're going to break the loop. But first we want to set our local inventory index as well, by the way. So we're going to drag the local inventory index in here as well. And if we found another slot where we can add it, we're going to set the local inventory index to that slot. And then we're going to break the loop. So plug it in and let's make sure it looks a little bit neater. There we go. So if this loop is completed, we want to check if we actually found a slot or not. So let's plug it in over here, grab our local isSlotFound boolean. And if this is true, then we can add the item to this inventory slot because it was empty. So then what we're going to do is simply grab a set array element for the player inventory. Drag in your player inventory, set array element. And then we can plug in our local inventory index for the index of the inventory, and the item is going to be the content to add. And we could enable size to fit, that doesn't really hurt. And then we want to plug this one inside of the true pin. So if we found an empty slot, we're gonna set it over here. And if we didn't find an empty slot yet, then we can also look if we have a slot that maybe has the same items in it, so we can stack them on top of that slot. So we're going to grab another for each loop with break over here and loop through our player inventory again. So drag in player inventory, grab a for each loop with break. And this time we want to plug the execution into the false pin of the branch over here. And now we're going to break our inventory content structure. And we're going to compare the name to the content structure from the content to add. So let's do an equal to, and then we're going to break our content to add over here as well. Break it and plug in the name in the comparison node. So then we're going to grab a branch over here. This is going to be the loop body. Plug it in. And if this is true, then we can stack the items on top of this slot. So we can drag in our isSlotFound boolean again. We're going to set this one to true. We're going to plug in the local inventory index and plug that one into the array index from the for each loop. And then for the player inventory contents, we want to set it as well to this slot that we found. So we're going to drag in the local player inventory contents, plug it in over here. And we're simply going to drag in the array element to set that. And after we did that, we can break the loop again. So plug it into the break pin and let's make sure that it looks a little bit cleaner. There we go. And now we need our branch again. So let's grab the branch, plug it into the completed pin. And again, we're going to check if we actually found a slot or not. So if we didn't find a slot over here, then we cannot add this item. So our inventory is full. So what we're going to do for now is add a print. And let's say inventory full cannot add item. There we go. And let's make sure that we actually see it if it pops up. So I'm going to make it red and make sure that it stays on screen a little bit longer. There we go. And if this one is true, then we can actually plug it into another array element setter, but this time we need to add the contents together. So what we can do is grab the player inventory, set array element and the local inventory index. We can copy and paste it. And we want to plug this one into the true pin over here from the second branch. And then we simply want to grab the player inventory contents and we're going to break the structure over here. And we also want to break the content to add. And then we can simply add the amounts together. So let's grab the item amount and let's add the other item amount to it. And then we can make another inventory structure. So drag off the item, make inventory contents, plug in the amount and directly plug in one of the row names. It doesn't matter which one you pick, they should be the same. So this is if we stack items on top of each other. And then after we added it to our array for the inventory, then we want to make sure that we do the few things like updating the HUD and stuff like that. So what we can do first is drag in the pickup from the input over here. So let's get our BP pickup. And we wanted to make sure that the pickup is actually valid. So we're going to drag off the pickup and grab an isValid node. And then we can plug both of the set array elements inside of the isValid node. So make sure you continue from both of them over here. So if the pickup is not valid, that means we do not want to remove it from the world save game. And if it is valid, we actually picked up an item from the world and then we're going to remove that item from the world save game. So what we want to do is grab in our third person game mode. And if this is valid, we're going to remove the saved pickup actor. So remove saved pickup actor. And then we can plug in the BP pickup. This goes into the isValid pin. So if the pickup is not valid, then we want to save the player's inventory. So we can drag off here, save current inventory. That's a function we have inside of our character already. So we're also going to plug in the not valid boolean pin over here. And then the last thing we want to do is update our HUD. So we can grab our third person controller over here and we can call our HUD update inventory grid. Plug it in over here and we simply plug in the player inventory from our variables, and we want to enable the player inventory boolean, so we actually update the correct grid. And then we are done over here, so we can grab a return node. Now we do need to make sure that we actually hook this branch up, so let me double check. So if the local inventory index is smaller than 0, if this is true, then we're going to look for slots. And if this is false, then we actually have an inventory index defined inside of our input. So what we want to do then? Well, that's not too hard. First of all, we want to grab another branch over here. And we're actually going to compare the items. So first of all, let's drag in our player inventory contents and let's break the structure. And do the same thing for the content to add. So drag it in, break structure. And we need to compare the item row names. So we dragged it on top of a slot, and if this slot actually contains the same items, then we can stack them. And if the slot contains another item, then we need to start searching for slots again where we may put it. So first, if this one is true, then we can simply plug this inside the set array element node that adds the items together. So you want to grab the one with the add node and not the one that simply has the content to add plugged in it. So from here, if this is true, we can simply plug it in over here. So we're going to add the contents together because they are the same. And if this is false, then we want to make sure that it's maybe not an empty slot that we dropped it on. So we can drag off the false pin over here, grab another branch. And this time we want to get the player inventory contents, and we're going to break the structure. And this time we're going to compare it to an empty slot. So the item row name is empty. This goes inside of our branch. So if the slot is currently empty, then we can plug it inside of the other set array element node. So if this is true, plug it into the set array element node that simply has the local content to add plugged in the item. And if this is also not an empty slot, then we need to start looking for slots. So then we can simply plug it right inside of our first for each loop over here. So then first we're going to check if we have other slots that may be empty, and if we do not have any empty slots, we're going to check if we have a slot with the same item so we can stack it on top of that. So we're going to grab the false pin over here and simply plug it inside of the first for each loop, and that should make everything work. So I think this function is done. We do not have any loose ends over here except for when our inventory is full, so this should be good to go. And now we actually want to change our remove item from inventory function as well, but that's going to be a whole lot simpler. So let's dive into remove item from inventory, and first of all, let me see. So we're checking if the player array is not empty. Well, we could keep that, that doesn't really matter. We have a drop into world, we need to keep that as well. So we want to add one input again, and that's our inventory index. So this time we're dragging an item outside of a slot, so we simply want to remove that item from the slot. So what we can do is go over here to our first for each loop, and we're going to get rid of that. So we're going to grab our player inventory and simply set an array element. So let's move over the execution pins over here, and we can move this stuff out of the way for now. So if we dragged it outside of a slot, we simply want to make this slot empty, so we can grab our inventory index from the input for the set array element. And then we can make an inventory content structure, so drag of the item, make contents, and we're going to make an empty slot. And let's enable size to fit. We shouldn't really need it, but you never know. So that should be good to go, and then all we need to do after this is save the player inventory and update the grid. So we should have these nodes over here, save current inventory, update inventory grid, and we can simply plug these in over here, and that should be good to go. So we can get rid of a bunch of local variables. We do need the drop location, but we can get rid of the item to remove, the amount, the item found, well, all of the other local variables actually. We only need the drop location, and we can get rid of the rest of this stuff as well. So this is the remove item from inventory function updated, and with those things in place we want to make sure that we change the calls where we have the inventory indexes added, so everything will match up. So let's start in the event graph of the third person character. So over here we have two calls to our add and remove item functions, so let's look for those. Add item to inventory, and we simply want to pass on the inventory index for the replicated event, and do the same thing for remove item. So we have those variables as an input right now. Then we can go inside of our pickup, so let's compile and save it and go into our BP pickup. So over here in the event graph we have add item to inventory. And because we are picking up an item from the world simply using our interact key, so we're not actually dropping it on top of another slot in the widget. So we're going to set the inventory index over here to -1, and that means we need to look for a valid slot to put this item in. So compile and save it. And with that in place, we're going to open our player inventory. So let's go to the widgets folder and open the widget blueprint player inventory event graph. And we want to look at the item dropped function first. So over here, we also want to make sure that we grab the inventory index for the add item to inventory node, and we want to plug it in as an input. So let me double check quickly. Yes, we want to make it an input for the item dropped event. So we're going to create a new input over here, and that's our inventory index. And that should be an integer. And then we're going to grab this one and plug it into the server add item to inventory node over here. And with that one in place, we can go inside of the onDrop event. So we have event onDropped over here. And in here we also want to make sure that we set our inventory index to -1. So this will register if we dropped it on top of our player inventory widget. So not the actual borders, but the rest you will see around here. And to make sure that this will actually register a drop, we want to grab our canvas panel and set the non-hit testable to visible. So that means if we drop an item over here, for example, or to the left side of the borders, then it will actually register a drop and the item won't get lost. So make sure that you do that as well. So with those things set up, we can go inside of our inventory grid. So that's the widget blueprint inventory grid. And in here we also have the item dropped event, and we want to set it to -1 over here as well. And then let's see, we have our actual inventory slot to take care of. So let's open the inventory slot widget, and these are the widgets that we are actually going to drop most of the items on. So if we look at the quote unquote finished project, so over here, the actual inventory widget, all of those are actual slots. So if we drop an item on here, a widget inventory blueprint slot should register it. If we drop it on top of here, above the slots, for example, that's why we need the other events. Or if we drop them outside of one of the borders. So that's just to catch everything that could happen, but that's not really what we're looking for. We only want to set up the dropping on the slots to make it actually work. So we want to add an onDrop event for this as well. So we're going to go to the functions, override, and create onDrop. And then let me grab my notes quickly. So that's the inventory slot. And that's this one. Okay, so what we want to do in here is pretty similar to what we did in the other onDrop events. So let's create a drag of the operation, and we're going to cast it to our drag drop inventory operation that we created in the previous video. And then we can simply get the variables from here. So we're going to get the item row name, we're going to get the item amount, and we're going to get isWorldItem. And then we can call our item dropped event on the player inventory widget. So we're going to drag in the player inventory and simply call item dropped. And then plug this one into the cast node. So we can plug in all variables, the item row name, the item amount, and the was world item. So for the inventory index, we can grab the actual variable from the actual widget slot. And then we want to grab the isWorldItem boolean. And we can plug this one into the dropped into world inventory. And if we grab a not bool and plug that one into the dropped on player inventory, so that should make everything work. And then we want to set the return value over here to true to make sure that our drag and drop event is marked as handled, and plug in the return node. So now we can actually drop items on top of our inventory slots as well. And I think we do need to make a small change in the event graph. So inside of our event graph, we also have a call to the server remove item from inventory. And in here, we want to grab the inventory index from our variables and plug that in to make sure that actually works. Okay, so that should be good to go as well. Now we could take a look at our in-game HUD quickly. So if we open our in-game HUD and go to the debug item counter. So right now we also added an item that's called empty. So our item counter will also register the item named empty, and that will pop up on the item counter. So it's not really a big deal, but it's also pretty simple to get rid of it. So what we could do, for example, over here we have the node where we clear the children that were already, okay, so debug item counter function, and over here we're clearing the vertical box. So we're going to make a little bit of room, and right before we add the new items, we're going to drag in the local item map. and we can drag off here and simply remove an item, and we're going to remove the empty items, and then we can plug that back in, so that way they won't appear on our item counter. Okay, so hopefully everything is correct and this should work. The only thing that doesn't work for now is the container side of it. So we only updated the player functions to drag and drop, and we need to take a look at the container functions in the next episode. But first let's make sure that this is actually working. So let's fire up a multiplayer session and see what happens. So first of all, I'm gonna assign the save slot for my client, and then let's have a look. Okay, so the borders don't really look that great. Let's see what happens if we drag an item. So we can actually drag and drop them around inside of our inventory, so that's good. If we drag it outside of our inventory, it will pop back into place, so that's good as well. It will actually register that as it should. So now let's take a look at the inventory stacking. So let's see if we pick up a dish over here, for example, we have a stash with 2 dishes, and we're going to pick up over here. So right now we have 2 stashes with 2 dishes, so they do not automatically stack, but we can stack them manually if we simply drag them on top of each other, so that's working as well. And if we drag an item on top of an item that's not the same, then it will automatically look for an empty slot and put it in there. So we have our sorting actually sorted out. Let's take a look at the border, because I think that's not too bad. So if we open up our inventory slot, I probably didn't plug it in over here. So we have the event construct, and if it's an empty slot, we are hiding the border and the text for the item amount, and I only plugged in the text. So make sure you plug in both of the nodes, and then that should fix the white borders. So now we actually have an inventory that looks correctly, and we have slots in place, and we can drag stuff around in the slots. We have a maximum size, and we can start working on stacking. So yeah, this is what we added today, and we're gonna add the same things for a container in the next episode, so we can also make sure that we can drag items around in the same fashion in a container. And after that we can start working on setting up maximum stack sizes, splitting stacks, and all those kinds of stuff. So that's today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider leaving a like, and I'll be back soon for more. Talk to you later, guys. Bye bye.